make a video on a car that I had when I was still working in the shop. It was a 2013 Fusion. This is sort of a little case study on how you can diagnose a vehicle that has a module problem, or in this case it was a communications problem, but how you could diagnose those kinds of problems using the wiring diagram and just a little bit of critical thinking and thinking about how the system works. So it was a 2013 Fusion. The customer came in with a concern about their passenger window being inoperative. The passenger door functions in general were inoperative. The door locks, the window. I think the lights weren't lighting up. I don't remember 100%. And then the radio, the front controls. Now on the Fusion, it had the front control display, the big screen in the front there, and none of that was working. It was totally blacked out. I don't believe there was something else on the circuit that I can show you a little later. The side obstacle detection. I don't believe it had a problem, but it was I don't remember. And the driver's door, everything else was working. The driver's door was fine, so it was just the passenger door and that front screen that was the problem. And so what I did, looking at that front screen, I didn't actually scan for codes first because I knew with that screen being dead that I probably had some kind of a module problem, and that if I went looking for codes, I was going to get an overwhelming number of codes. I wouldn't be easy to pinpoint the problem just by looking at codes. You can sort of look down the code list and see what the majority of them are pointing to, but when you have a module failure with so many different modules talking to each other, it can get a little bit difficult to pinpoint exactly which module has failed, which one isn't communicating. So what I did instead of scanning for codes, which would be normally you'd think would be your first step, but instead of that, just using a little bit of knowledge just from being in the trade for so long, and also just kind of thinking how the whole system worked, I did a network test instead of a DTC test first. And what I found was that my PDM, so my passenger door module, and my FICM, my front control interface modules, neither were communicating on the network. Neither of them were communicating on the network. So my next step then was to print out a wiring diagram. Now, you can do this just on the computer. I like printing them out sometimes, not every single case, but sometimes I like to print them out because it gives you something you can play with in your hands, right? Something you can tape together. Like in this case, I have taped together, it was 4 pages of our network, as you can see, all the way to the end. You'd want to get, now if it's a real big network and you got a lot of pages, it can be a bit difficult to print them all out. You might want to just grab bits and pieces of it that look important, or as you work along, print out the page that you're on or something like that. But I like to print it out because I wanted to see exactly what was happening with my network, right? So we know that we had a PDM. Where can I write this? So we had, and I'll put it with our DLC connector. Why not? Doing this in my dining room, kind of. So we had the PDM failed, and we had the FICM failed, front control interface module. So there was no communication with either of those on our network. Now, what network are we looking at? I don't know yet, right? I don't remember every single system. Guessing, right, and with the advantage of having done it already, my guess would be a medium speed CAN, because these aren't exactly super important modules. Front control interface module, we don't care a whole lot about it, but that would be sort of a beginning guess. But it doesn't matter because we have the wiring diagram in front of us here, so we can start. Here's page 1 of our DLC with our DLC connector. Moving forward, now I've stuck with the medium speed CAN just because I know where it is, but you would find the modules. So in this case, we had, I hope you can see that, we have the PDM and the front control. So you would go and find the modules that you know have failed and work backwards. Now you can see it's a violet and gray wire. We go back to our DLC connector, we have a violet and gray wire. So we know we're dealing with an MSCAN fault. Now, moving forward, we go back to our two modules that have failed. Now the next step, so we've found where we need to be, or we've found a starting point for our diagnosis. We have our PDM and our FICM. Neither of them are communicating right now, so we can give them a little red X because we know those are in trouble. If we move forward in the wiring diagram, now another thing I want to say is that the entire network isn't down. So when I did the network test, the only two that failed were the PDM and the FICM. So that tells me that this medium speed network is still working in some way because I still have all these other modules, right? So the next step is to find out where my problem is, what has happened, right? You got to pinpoint the location. And it's actually, if you start looking at the wiring diagram, it's actually not that bad, not that hard to do. So if you start with the failed modules, right? Or actually, let's start at the other side. Let's start down here. So we'll start at the DLC connector because that's where we start from the scan tool, where we start communicating with everything, right? So we'll start at the DLC connector. We'll go up our two violet and gray wires. And you can see here, if you don't know how a wiring diagram works, we have HG. Actually, why don't we highlight it? So we have medium speed low, or sorry, medium speed high, medium speed low, and we have H and G. So we move on to the next part, which is right here, H and G, and we go through our very first splice block. Okay, and if you remember wiring diagrams, these dots mean that these wires break off. So in this case, down here, it just goes to ends and harness. It's not. That's a terrible highlighter. It's not a something we have to look at, right? But if we had a problem in this splice box, we've reached our first sort of area that we can look at. If we had a problem in this splice block, we'd have to imagine that the rest of the network going this way would have a problem as well. So it can't be this splice block, because if this splice block had failed, and I'm focusing on splice blocks because splices in general are a very common failure point for wiring harnesses. You've jammed a lot of wires, in this case only two, but usually, as you can see in this one, you jam a bunch of wires. Here we have 4 going into one connector, you crimp them and then send some more out on their way, and that's usually where a failure will occur, is in a splice block. These ones in particular are a goofy looking little one because they're a square. I'll put a picture up at the end of the video showing you, but it's a square with wires going in and then some open spaces where you can see the connections inside. So they're kind of open. They're not you can't see that picture. There you go. They're kind of open, not your typical splice, but even regular splices, if you remember, there's been lots of TSBs talking about replacing splices because they weren't crimped properly from the factory. So splices in general are a great spot to start, at the very least, in wiring diagnosis, electronics diagnosis, that kind of stuff. I start with splice blocks, eliminate them if they're okay, and then you move on to your wires, because wiring is much harder to find. You got to dig through usually quite a lot, take a lot of components apart to get to wiring. So I start at the splice box. It's nice and easy. So we've hit splice block 15. We imagine there's probably not a problem here, because if we had a problem with this one, we're going to have a problem with the rest of the network, and we have stuff communicating on the network. So let's keep going. So we head on down here, and now we've hit splice block 16. Now in this particular vehicle, the GPSM and the accessory protocol interface module are both working. So we know that we don't have a problem, or we hope we don't have a problem with 16. You can see it splits off again inside. If we head up here, so I'll keep going because these are still working. This is it was a very good use case in that we only had 2 modules that had failed, or failed to communicate with the rest of the network working. So we know that these 2 are communicating, which means this splice block And these connections inside here and these connections going up to here are probably okay. We don't know about the rest of it up here. We got to keep looking. So you keep moving along. And you can do this on the computer. It's just a bit harder to follow along, but not too bad. I just like, again, sometimes highlighting. So we'd head over to Y and Z, which is over here. Come down, over, and we hit splice block 35. So again, you look at splice block 35 and you see what comes into it, what's still left in our circuit. We can see we have an RTM. We've still got our driver's door module. And remember, everything on our driver's door worked. This was okay. Everything was on the DDM was fine. Everything on the DSM was fine as well. So that's okay. That's okay. And our RTM was okay as well. I didn't have a problem with the radio transceiver. So you keep going, keep rolling through. We're going this way. And here is our first sort of, or another break point where these wires are connected inside. We keep heading up, out the splice block. Now something interesting happens, a little bit interesting, where we split off to these two splice blocks. So what happens over here is this is actually taking signals from two different SODs, two different site obstacle detection modules over here. So I'll show you that in a second. But we're getting closer to our failed modules. So let's go over to our failed modules. We can see them now. We know how to get to them. So let's roll through. An important thing to remember also about wiring diagrams is make sure you are working on the correct model of vehicle. Ford does not specify, they don't break it into model chunks. You can have a fusion page and then you'll have an MKZ page right after it. So make sure you're working on the right car. It will also won't give you, it won't break it up into models with blind spot or whatever like that. It just, again, that page will be right after another page, right? So just be careful, pay attention to what you're looking at. Let's get up to our modules. So here we go. We come up here and we have a problem with both of these modules and they both come into the same splice block. 1 and 2. All right. So we've mapped everything out. If we want to keep going, now remember I said I didn't have a problem with the site obstacle detection modules. So we've hit this, but this could potentially be a problem. But could this one potentially be a problem? Now, the answer is no, obviously, because we have two paths, right? And if we come from the SODs here, AB, AA, AC, and AD, you can see they also have another path through. So them working doesn't really indicate to you that this is a problem or this is a problem. The big key here is that these two modules are not working and they only go into one block. Let me move that over. They only have one entrance in here and one exit, right? So this is really where you would start your diagnosis because of that fact, because they only have one way in, right, and one way out. You'd be looking at that. These, if I didn't make clear, your SODs have an ADAC where they come into this splice block, right, but they also have ABAA where they come out and bypass the splice block. So these could still be communicating. If we didn't have this circuit here that you can't see, this one, if this didn't exist, then they would also not be communicating because of this splice block is their only way to communicate with the rest of the network. But they don't do that for site obstacle because it's a safety device as well. It's part of your blind spot information. They want to give it some more chances to communicate, so they give it another path. Whereas again, the PDM and the front control, they're not critical components. We don't have to give them multiple paths to talk to the computer or talk to the network. So we know we have one entrance. We've got one exit for these two modules. We start our diagnosis at splice block 36, and another thing is, how do we know it's not a module power and ground problem? Well, the odds of two modules, I didn't pull the wiring diagram for these two modules, but the odds of them both failing a power and ground on a power and ground circuit, or both failing because of a power and ground, is pretty low. They don't share a ground. I mean, that's in the passenger door. That's your front control interface module. They don't share a ground, and they don't share power. So losing power to both of them.
Don't lose power.
So like I was saying, the odds of them losing power and ground, both of them losing power and ground, is very small, which again pinpoints me to a communication problem. And in this particular vehicle, when you went looking for splice block 36, I'll put a picture of the location of it. It was on the driver's side in the rear where the passenger would put their feet. So if you had people, and it was in the winter, so if you had people coming in with their wet boots, their muddy boots, they were filling that well, right, that passenger well, with their dirt, or with their muddy boots. The person didn't have floor mats. There were no floor mats down there at all. It was just regular carpet. So this splice block with these open chambers in them was full inside of corrosion. So there was no communication getting through this entire splice block. And remember, it didn't matter for our SODs, for the side obstacle detection modules, because they had another path. They could bypass this module entirely. So they didn't throw a code. There was nothing wrong with them. It was just these two modules that had failed. And there you go. That's, if you use a little bit of common sense, a little bit of learning how the wiring diagram works and how communication works, you can use process of elimination by looking at what your network test is telling you, not necessarily just your codes, because your codes could have led you, right, if you have, I don't know, if you have your DDM not communicating with your PDM, or your FICM not communicating with your APIM not seeing your FICM, you're kind of a little bit lost with what has happened, right? Because these modules communicate with so many different modules, and so many different modules communicate with them. It can be hard sometimes with a code check, with just a code check, to figure out which module has actually failed, which module is actually having a problem on the network. Whereas if you go with a network test, assuming you know what's optional and what is factory, like what comes with the vehicle, and then what is an optional module, you have to make sure you understand that as well. If you know that, and you know that these modules are supposed to be there and they're supposed to be communicating, but they're not, well, that gives you a starting point. You can jump right to that module and work your way back to the DLC connector. Hope that helps a bit. Sorry for the interruption, and thank you.